Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV on the theme, Can Boris Survive? The initial results from yesterday's local elections have been coming in overnight, with the Conservatives on track to lose around 250 seats across England, including in London, where they have lost Barnet, Wandsworth and even Westminster to Labour. Yet the losses are not as bad as some Conservatives feared amid the partygate scandal and the cost of living crisis, with Labour failing to make significant progress in much of the former Red Wall. Keir Starmer this morning has claimed that the results are a turning point as we approach the next general election. But is this really true? Some self-styled local Conservatives have blamed the Prime Minister for election losses. So will the results increase pressure on him to resign, or will he lead his party into that next general election? Joining me to discuss this are Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, Catherine Haddon, columnist and leader writer for The Telegraph, Tim Stanley, comment and features editor for City AM, Sasha O'Sullivan, and contributing writer to The New Statesman, Martin Fletcher. So, as we've been talking about London, perhaps I can start with you, Sasha. London is now even more of a Labour stronghold than it already was, with the Conservatives losing those flagship councils. What's gone wrong for the Conservatives in London?
Well, I think, to be honest, it's more about what the Labour Party has managed to do right. I think the fact that Labour have taken Westminster in particular is a kind of sign that Keir Starmer was able to do at least part of what he was brought in to do, which is steady the ship. There was a lot of angst towards the Labour Party after the years of Jeremy Corbyn. And I think the fact that they've managed to kind of bring Westminster over to them will be a sign that, okay, we're managing to get people to trust us on the economy. We're managing to kind of peel back some of that hard left Corbyn era from the past and actually move forward. Whether he can actually turn that into, a win in Parliament is a very different question. But I think on a local London level, it's a huge deal. And the fact that we've kind of seen Wandsworth and Barnet go Labour as well. These are leafy suburbs where people are talking about housing. A lot of people are worried about low traffic neighbourhoods, which have got a lot of talk. But mainly, I think that there's a lot of worry about the economy. And that's really what we've seen, is that more people are willing to trust Labour with the economy.
I wonder if the Marble Arch Mound had much of a role to play in Westminster in particular.
Yes.
But if they bring back al fresco dining in Soho, then I think we'll be pleased with that. Great. And so do you think that, you said Labour's doing well, but Boris's appeal for a lot of Conservatives is that he was an electoral asset. Do you think he has turned now from being an asset to actually a liability?
Well, I think definitely. I think the problem with these elections is, as we were kind of saying before this started, is you can kind of read what you want into it. Labour has managed to take a huge amount out of London, but as a lot of people have already said, stalled elsewhere in the country. Whether or not this isn't a definitive anti-Boris vote. In London, perhaps it is, but that's not enough for MPs to necessarily say, okay, he's not going to be able to take us into an election, which means that they'll actually have to, do some thinking for themselves and make up their own minds on this.
And Tim, so levelling up is a massive part of Boris Johnson's agenda. A lot of that is focused on so-called left behind areas in the Midlands and the North. Do you think that people in traditional Tory heartlands in the South are starting to feel a bit neglected?
Yes and no. First of all, I've not set up this camera very well, so sometimes I go into dramatic silhouette. It looks like I'm giving evidence against a gang, and I don't want to do that.
Perhaps you are.
Perhaps I am. I often hear this, the South hates levelling up. I don't think that's true, actually, partly because Southerners see the whole country as their country. And one of the first, whenever you speak to Southerners about what's wrong with Britain, they will typically say things like London's too powerful, or there aren't enough people going into apprenticeships and skilled jobs, and we can't hire anyone around here, and all this sorts of concerns. So I've always thought that the idea that the South feels left behind by levelling up is a bit of a myth, and I'm not even sure where it comes from. The people I speak to do not articulate to me some sense of resentment against the North because the Tories are interested in it. I don't see that. What I do see is some typical traditional electoral problems for the Tories, plus one very big long-term problem, which I'm not quite sure how they'll fix. The short-term stuff is the damage to Boris's reputation. I think he can weather it. This is due to Cakegate. I think he can weather it. The problem is that it feels as though it's like the government is a donkey traveling through the desert, and people keep attaching bags of sand to it. And the sand is scandal. And after a while, you get to the point where, sorry, this analogy is so bad, but you get to the point where the sand breaks the camel's back. You know what I mean? There is just this sense of we are reaching peak scandal, whereby the government's reputation will be so damaged that people will be of the opinion that after 12 years in power, it's just an exhausted, decadent government that needs to go. So that's what Cakegate is really about. It's about the wearing down of the Tory brand, because they've been in government a long time. The second short-term problem is prices. That's huge around here. You have people like my mother, fixed income, massive council tax because she has the misfortune to accidentally live in a detached house, not that she can afford it, her mortgage is paid off. Fixed income, huge price increases. A lot of people who traditionally vote Conservative are just starting to feel, can I actually afford to? And the third short term.
Sorry, what sort of area is that?
I'm in Kent. I'm in Sevenoaks. I'm in Sevenoaks in Kent. And the third short-term problem is the decision to raise taxes, which is hammering people like me and the aspirational middle classes. And if Tories are elected to do anything, it's not to raise taxes. And given that the South is an area of aspiration where people traditionally like to keep more of their own money, that's really grinding them down. But there is one long-term problem that may or may not spell disaster for the Tories, which is Brexit. We talk a lot about how Brexit transformed voting patterns in the North. Well, I do believe it's had a longer, slower effect upon voting patterns in the South. I don't quite know how it'll play out, but a lot of people who traditionally voted Tory were so disgusted by Brexit that they will now consider voting Lib Dem or even Labour once it becomes fully decarbonised and detoxified. I suspect that's what's happening in London, that there is a demographic change, an intellectual change, and you see that in parts of the world down south, where very strange things are taking place in voting, like Worthing, which is becoming increasingly competitive for Labour. Why is that? Yeah, it's demographic change, but it's also because the South, large parts of the South, particularly the more urban parts of the South, were pro-Remain. So if you take, I'll just finish by saying my constituency of Sevenoaks, the centre of the town, this is a solidly Tory constituency because of the villages. The centre of the town is Lib Dem and voted Remain. So I'm not saying that this seat could ever be lost by the Tories, but if you see that replicated in marginal seats across the South, you see how in the long run there is an intellectual shift, a taste shift away from the Tories and towards a more liberal progressive style politics. And I think in the long run that could do damage for the Tories down south.
Yeah, and they don't have Corbyn to scare people into voting Conservative, and also people like Dominic Raab are seemingly in pretty serious trouble. Martin, talking about Boris Johnson's image, of course, he's tried to shift attention away from partygate or Cakegate, as Tim said, towards the response to Ukraine, which even the government's critics, people across Europe they've praised it as being a pretty exceptional response. Do you think that's worked? Has that saved his skin in the short term, maybe? Or do you think that ultimately voters have other priorities? Of course, Winston Churchill was booted out very unceremoniously in 45, so that won't really be a factor.
I saw very little evidence that Ukraine was an issue on the doorstep. I think people, he's doing quite well there. He's doing well there, in fact. But he's not doing anything that any other leader wouldn't do. I think people recognize that there's a large element of showmanship there in the Churchillian rhetoric and the dramatic trip to Kiev and so on and so forth. But I think they see it people are beginning to see through him. They saw through the Rwanda asylum plan. They saw through the announcement of privatizing Channel 4. This is sort of throwing red meat out. People are beginning to understand that. No, there's no secret. The results were a reflection, firstly, of cost of living, and secondly, of partygate. But by partygate, I mean the much broader issue of trust and honesty and decency and integrity.
I wonder, sorry to cut you off, but why isn't Labour doing better then? Because the government, as I said, has been beset by scandal. Surely Labour should be making more gains.
Well, I think, if you look at where they were 2 years ago, they're not doing badly. But I accept they haven't built the sort of momentum that's going to carry them towards a majority government in 2024. They haven't got the sort of momentum that New Labour had in 95, 96. It's okay, but it's not good enough. I'm not defending. I think Keir Starmer is an honest and decent and straight man, and infinitely preferable to the present incumbent. But yes, he's not blessed with great charisma. I accept that. It's a slow process. I think the answer has to be, and this last night's results demonstrate this, is you have to have some sort of electoral pact, some sort of non-aggression agreement, whether it's formal or informal. There's no way on present showing that Labour can win an outright majority next time at the next election. The Lib Dems are doing well. The Greens did surprisingly well. Even Independents did surprisingly well yesterday. There was a sort of informal pact in some parts of the country. I haven't drilled down into the numbers, but I suspect it was quite effective. I suspect we're going to see this in the Wakefield and in the Tiverton and Honiton by-elections. And I think that's the sort of the general direction we're moving in.
Yeah, I do want to ask Catherine about that. Of course, Oliver Dowden wrote his letter in which he was complaining about a supposed pact and that everybody was ganging up on him.
I don't remember him objecting to the unspoken pact between UKIP and the Tories in 2019.
But Catherine, so how feasible is an electoral pact? Obviously, there are campaign rules which govern what you can do, and do you think that could have a significant impact at the next general election? You're on mute.
Sorry, one of us was always bound to do that. Look, I mean, looking at the results of this, one of my colleagues, Alex Nice, had a very good phrase, which is the choose your own adventure election results. And yes, if you're looking for the Progressive Alliance, the evidence is all there. Paula Surridge put out a tweet earlier saying that, the key here is a little progress for Labour plus greater progress for the Lib Dems could very easily see the Conservatives out of office. So you don't just need to talk about whether or not Keir Starmer is actually managing to sort of fulfil the promise of the post-Corbyn era and all that stuff. The issue isn't just about electoral rules and so forth. There are obviously ways you could surmount that if you wanted to. The problem is also about what voters think about that. And it's because a lot of this is varied across the country. So it depends where you're talking about. There are areas, obviously, where Progressive Alliance, I'm sure, would go very well because people want the reassurance of who they're going to vote for is going to make a difference. A lot of people who feel that the electoral system doesn't, suit them, doesn't work in their favour. On the other hand, there are many people who will still feel strongly about the last alliance, the coalition government, or indeed about the DUP's relationship with the Conservatives or Conservatives with DUP, depending on which way round you look at it. And generally in this country, I mean, pre-2010, we would have said, oh, coalitions aren't for the UK. So the idea of parties working together, and particularly for Labour and Lib Dems, there's a lot of history there. You go back to 83, you talk about the sort of, the rise of Social Democrats, the Lib Dems, Gang of Four, all that kind of stuff. There's kind of a lot of deep-seated history there with it. And they know, which is why Oliver Dowden wrote that letter, that there is a potential to bash them with it. And it's not really just about the Lib Dems. The damage that Labour will be wary of is saying, oh, it's going to be the SNP that put you into government. And we've only just at the start of seeing election results coming in from Scotland, but some early signs that Labour is doing better than the Conservatives up there. So all of these issues are going to play a factor. But I think, going to the wider discussion and the why choose your own adventure is really important, is that what this means now for the government, for Boris Johnson. Yeah, we've got this first question of Boris Johnson's survival and so forth. That comes down to Conservative MPs. But it's then about where do you pivot, and how much is it CCHQ number 10, talking to Oscar Levido, whoever, and thinking what actually wins us the election next time round, and how much are you pulled in different directions by your own Conservative MPs with a 70+ majority. Boris Johnson's already struggling to please the different wings of his party. All those MPs are going to be taking different lessons out of this. Some down south are going to be very worried, whether or not it isn't a sort of levelling up, fight to the death or anything like that between north and south. They're still going to be thinking, well, hang on, what you're trying to do to win votes in this area is not winning me votes down south or wherever. And so that's going to be the hardest difficulty, is not just how do you gain an election in 2 years' time or go for one earlier, it's also how do you govern between now and then without being pulled in all those different directions.
Yeah, I have a new unifying message. Obviously, we don't have the results yet, so I don't want to dwell on this, but I just want to touch very briefly on because you mentioned the SNP, of course. The union in Northern Ireland is one of the big issues of this local election. Maybe first to you, Tim. Of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol has been a massive issue in those elections. Sinn Féin could be the largest party. How much trouble do you think the union is in?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I guess it's being pulled in all different directions as well because of the SNP too. I just don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know what the answer is to that question. I'm not qualified to say what the effect of Sinn Féin being the largest party in Northern Ireland is. I'm sure someone else can.
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe back to you, Catherine. I think that you want to say something. Are we looking at more paralysis and devolution? Are we looking at, obviously, Sinn Féin will eventually want to push for some sort of border poll potentially in the future. We've got the consent arrangements for the Northern Ireland Protocol. What do you think the ramifications could be?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
I think this is a really big test for how the governing arrangement works in Northern Ireland, because in theory, it ought to work that way. The whole point of a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister who are effectively equals is that it ought to be able to work in reverse, just the same way. But we know that there's some issues that the DUP have got with the process, but more importantly with the Westminster government, with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the impact that this is then having on voters. Although you look to Northern Ireland, there's many other issues going on. But I think all politicians in Northern Ireland should see this actually as a test on them in terms of what voters want, because the whole point of an election is that voters should be able to say what they want. If there's a massive increase in the vote for Alliance, they should be listening to that and thinking about what does that mean actually about the old tribal rivalries in Northern Ireland. And I can't speak to what Sinn Féin might do, but I would imagine that they'd be more interested in cementing themselves in terms of Northern Ireland in that position rather than sort of immediately jumping into the next. And it's the same for Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, in a sense, because this is not a sort of a poll moment for her. The polling at the moment still suggests that actually Remain in Scotland is edging ahead again. So she also needs to think longer term tactically about how much is it about governing and how much is it about moving towards your party's supposed stated end goals.
I think Sinn Féin will be very keen not to frighten the horses. They'll wait till the Irish elections in 2025. And in the meantime, they'll be lobbying very hard in the United States for Irish-American pressure on the British government for some sort of border poll, not immediately, but in the foreseeable future. But this is another looming headache caused, frankly, by Boris Johnson. The DUP were foolish enough to trust him when he promised them that there wouldn't be a border in the Irish Sea. He went back on his word to get Brexit done, in inverted commas. The DUP now will not rejoin the executive unless the Northern Irish Protocol is scrapped. And if it is, we risk a trade war with the European Union and further disruption of EU-UK relations at a time when, because of Ukraine, we should be pulling all together in the right direction. It's a horrible mess caused by a Prime Minister who's broken his word.
We could talk about that, I think, for the rest of the episode if we want to. So let's jump back to Great Britain for now. And Sasha, so you think the Prime Minister's leadership is more precarious today than it was yesterday, or do you think it's more or less the same?
Look, I don't think it's had a seismic effect on Boris Johnson's leadership overall. I think there will definitely be some MPs who are looking at some of these results and asking questions of it, but it wasn't the moment where suddenly they thought, oh God, this was so bad, we must submit all our letters and get rid of this guy. I do actually think it's really interesting what Martin just said about Northern Ireland, because I think it goes to a kind of wider problem where Boris Johnson is, in trying to get voters in one area, is selling off voters in the other area. And it's this kind of, it must be exhausting to be Boris Johnson, because it's this kind of constant seesawing of, we're going to do Right to Buy 2.0 to try and get people who want houses in London and who are renting, but we're going to sell off Channel 4, and in doing that we're going to alienate some of the metropolitan voters, and then we're going to get Brexit done and to get the Red Wall voters, and in doing that going to cause headaches for us in Northern Ireland. So I do think that this wider fracturing of conservative policies is the problem for Boris Johnson. I think he needs to figure out what he stands for, and I think he needs to start governing rather than just constantly trying to appease different sections of voters, every second week.
His government by plate spinning or something.
Yeah.
I mean, Tim, do you think, is that the problem? It's just there's no ideological base for his government?
Yes, there is no base, partly because of Brexit and because the Tories never wanted it, suddenly had it, and had to turn it into an electoral message that could win them a majority. And to do that, they touched upon the Red Wall and levelling up. So things have been outside their control and have forced them into a particular direction. All the same time, they have to remain distinctly Tory. And there are tensions between what Brexit promises and what Toryism traditionally tries to deliver. What Brexit promised was the money for the NHS, take back control, and more. I think there was an inherently more collectivist kind of Britain that was promised by Brexit, because it was more about the nation and less about neoliberal global trade. But at the same time, Toryism, or at least in its modern variety, is all about free trade. It's all about the individual, and it's all about cutting taxes. So there are some inherent tensions there. But looking at it from a point of view of someone perhaps more on the right of the spectrum, I would look at those election results and say it's all right. Because they did okay where they need to be doing okay, which is the Red Wall, because that's what they need to win again in order to get another majority next time. They lost bits of the London, but those of us more on the right have written off London a long time ago as a kind of contemporary Tower of Babel. I mean, really, we're done with it. We don't care. And if they really care about Channel 4 that much, I mean, really, I'd be very surprised if that loses any votes at all. So I think actually the right, who are giving him the biggest trouble, will be quite satisfied with the results and won't be inclined to move against him. His long-term problem, I just come back to what I said at the very beginning, is prices and taxes. Those are not just traditional Tory issues, inflation and taxes, but they're also the things which inevitably actually decide an election. Because
on the economy, of course, I mean, there's rumours that Boris Johnson is going to do a summer reshuffle. Do you expect the chancellors for the chop?
Yeah, that is the general mood, actually. And I'm really surprised how far and how fast Rishi Sunak's popularity within the Conservative Party has sunk. And ironically, it's sunk over his wealth and his tax arrangements, which are things that normally Tories are very sympathetic about. So that's really quite surprised me. I think if you're a Tory chancellor who raises taxes, then you probably are in the long run a dead duck. But the question is who replaces him, and that's very interesting. Will it be Sajid Javid? Will it be Zahawi? I don't know. But I do think if just to pause and reflect upon the changing nature of conservatism, it's pretty extraordinary that we're looking to get rid of one chancellor of Asian descent to replace him possibly either with someone of Muslim descent or someone of Iraqi descent. I mean, that really does show you how much the Tory party in Britain has changed. That's the competition to be chancellor.
Very interesting. Okay, we're nearing the end. So sort of a final question. And I'll ask you all, what are your predictions of when the general election is going to be? Will Boris Johnson still be leading the Conservatives? And do you think the Conservatives will win that historic 5th consecutive term in office? Maybe starting with you, Catherine.
Oh, Okay, on the basis of nothing at all other than sort of just how weird these things seem to go with elections, I'm going to say next autumn, after a year's speculation about is he going to go for it now. And I think I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about hung parliaments and coalition governments, and I'm not going to predict an actual result. But there may be a majority, but if there is a majority, it will be very small. And if that's the case, it's probably Conservative.
Right. So maybe Labour largest party.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. Sasha?
Look, in terms of on when, I think I think the Conservative Party have no idea when they want the next election to be. So I think they're really going to wait and see on what happens with the cost of living over the autumn and the winter. If next spring things are still looking pretty dire, they might try and hold off. Though, I do see the kind of rationale for having it next autumn. Will Boris Johnson still be there? Who knows? He's managed to do it before. So,
yeah, I mean, the Bank of England projections were pretty bad.
Yeah.
Martin?
Well, I'm going to throw some questions back at you.
Go on.
Number one, in what way is Boris Johnson still an asset for his party? Number two, does anyone doubt that if there had been a plausible alternative, he would be gone by now? And number three, how can he turn things around? Things are only going to get worse. The cost of living crisis is going to get worse, and he's got very little fiscal latitude or funds available to do much about it. Partygate is going to get worse. We're going to get Sue Gray's report. We're going to get, probably more fines and by-election losses in Tiverton and Wakefield. My overall read of last night is, yes, he's clinging on to the red wall, but I think he's losing millions of traditional centrist Tories, of which I would include myself as one, by the way, for whom the Tories are no longer the party of law and order, no longer the party of fiscal or moral rectitude, no longer the party of pragmatism and competence, no longer the party of business. And I think, if I was the MP for Uxbridge and North Ruislip, however they deem now you pronounce it, with a majority of only 7,000, I'd be really worried about my own seats at the next general election.
Yes, luckily as host, I don't have to actually answer any of your questions, which is great. And back to dark side, Tim.
I've gone dark. Well, obviously for me, representing populist conservatism, I want Boris to succeed because I have a horrible feeling that if he goes down, my project goes with it. I don't trust the Tory party not to slip back into being that sort of John Major-ish classical liberal party that I certainly wouldn't support. So I have a personal investment, and I also have a sense of personal loyalty towards Boris Johnson, who I just happen to personally quite like. But can he win? Well, I spoke to some people on Starmer's staff a couple of weeks ago, and I said, I think you're going to win the next election. And they seemed surprised by that. They were really surprised, not just because I was saying it, but because I don't think they've come to terms with the possibility themselves. I think Labour certainly can win. I think it's moving towards winning, but there's something about Keir Starmer, and these election results perhaps show it, that suggests the public isn't quite sold on him yet. And there's still a part of me that believes in the populist project and in Boris personally, that I think perhaps it's 50-50, but Boris might be able to pull it off.
Very interesting. We've been very punctual with the discussion, which is great. So thank you very much to Catherine, Tim, Sasha, and Martin for joining me. Really appreciate your time. Thank you to those of you watching as well. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and goodbye.